In the blink of an eye, I went from an ordinary man to another man's spouse, an omega forced into marriage with the poorest, lamest fisherman on the coast. But no one could have guessed that the one forced into this marriage would turn a crumbling straw hut into a fortune worth thousands of taels of silver, and turn that cold fisherman's heart into his own forever. I opened my eyes in a dark room, the smell of salted fish and seaweed drifting through the air. My head was still spinning when the memories of a stranger flooded in. I was Zhang Xia, an omega, and today was the day I'd be married off to a limping fisherman in Heiwang fishing village. I used to be an ordinary man living in a completely different world, and now I carried this new identity, about to kneel and bow in marriage to someone I'd never even met. Outside the door, my stepmother's shrill voice rang out, urging me to hurry to the wedding palanquin. I clenched my fists, forcing down a wave of dizziness. Before I could resist, before I could even ask why, the palanquin was already swaying, carrying me out of a house that had never truly been mine, toward the sea, toward a life that was completely unfamiliar. The memories of the original Zhang Xia grew clearer in my mind. My birth father, Zhang Defu, was weak-willed and afraid of his second wife. My stepmother, Madame Tan, was cruel, always scheming to funnel every advantage to her own daughter, Zhang Qiu. The good marriage that should have been mine was swapped out right before the wedding. The wealthy match in town went to Qiu, while I was pushed off to this poor, crippled fisherman in a distant coastal village. My stepmother had already pocketed every bit of the betrothal gifts the groom's family sent, leaving nothing for me to bring along. I gripped the hem of my wedding robe, a wave of fury rising up on behalf of this body's former owner. But fury changed nothing. The palanquin kept swaying on toward the sea. Before the palanquin set off, I heard arguing coming from the main room. Zhang Defu stood outside the door, not daring to look me in the eye. "Take care of yourself on the road," he said. That was all, not a single word of apology. Madame Tan stood beside him, her voice ice cold. "A crippled fisherman is still a husband. Behave yourself and don't shame the Zhang family." Qiu stood behind her, the corner of her mouth curling up, satisfaction plain in her eyes. I looked at the three of them and said nothing. In my past life, I'd never knelt to beg anyone, and in this one, I had no intention of starting. I turned and stepped into the palanquin, leaving behind a family that had never truly seen me as one of their own. The palanquin jolted along the rutted dirt road, the sound of waves growing louder with every step. I lifted the curtains slightly and peeked outside. The sea stretched deep blue to the horizon, rows of old wooden boats moored close together, fishing nets drying along the sand, the sharp smell of fish and salt filling my nose. Villagers lined the road, peering curiously at the palanquin, murmuring about Beixiu's new bride. The place was poor, but it had a life of its own, nothing like anywhere I'd known before. I took a deep breath and told myself that whatever this new identity brought, I wouldn't let it drown me. The palanquin stopped in front of a small thatched house, its earthen walls plain and worn, sitting right at the water's edge. Drums sounded along with scattered clapping. I was helped down, a red veil covering my head, leaving only a thin sliver of light to see through. Through that gap, I saw a pair of legs standing across from me, one buckled slightly under the weight, clearly the mark of an old injury that had never fully healed. "Ye Beixiu, bow to heaven and earth," the officiant's voice rang out. The man across from me bowed his head slowly, his movements unhurried but steady. This was the person I was about to call my husband, a name, an entirely unfamiliar life. The wedding ceremony was simple, just a few tables set for the neighbors. I sat quietly in the room, listening to the chatter drifting in from the yard. "That Zhang boy's so pretty, what a waste marrying him off to crippled Beixiu. SHH, what if Beixiu hears you? So what if he does? Everyone knows his leg's ruined, he's lucky to get a spouse at all." Another voice cut in, edged with mockery. I clenched my fists in my lap, not out of pity for myself, but out of anger on behalf of the man sitting beside me, a man who hadn't even had the chance to say one kind word to me yet. On our wedding night, the room was lit by nothing but a single flickering oil lamp. Beixiu sat a good distance away, in no hurry to come closer. "You don't have to be afraid," he said first, his voice low and unhurried, each word careful. "I'll sleep outside tonight. Rest and get used to the place first." I looked up at him, surprised, meeting his eyes for the first time. His face was sun-browned, his gaze sincere without a trace of pretense. No pressure, no demands, nothing like what I'd imagined a forced marriage would be. I nodded slightly, a strange, unfamiliar feeling rising in my chest, not quite relief, but no longer fear either. It wasn't fully light yet when I heard soft movement outside. I stepped out and saw Beixiu tying up a torn net, his left leg buckling every time he shifted his weight, though his hands moved quick and steady. The house was bare, the rice jar in the corner of the kitchen barely half full, a few chipped clay pots stacked neatly to the side. "You're up early," he said, glancing up, looking a little caught off guard to see me there. "I head out early and won't be back until evening, just rest at home." I looked at his uneven gait, at the worn-out net, and quietly did the math in my head. This household needed someone else running things. "What happened to your leg?" I asked directly, not bothering to dance around it. Beixiu paused for a moment before answering, his tone flat, as if telling someone else's story. "Last year I got caught in a sudden storm out at sea. The boat capsized and my leg got tangled in the anchor line, the tendon tore. The physician said it could have been saved if treated in time, but we didn't have the money back then, so it was left as is." I stayed quiet for a moment, picturing a man struggling against the raging waves, enduring the pain with no one to help him in time. "Can it still be treated now?" he shrugged. "Doesn't really matter anymore, I'm used to it." I frowned, this was something I wasn't going to let go. Around noon, the grandparents came by along with older brother Zion and his wife, Yaoi. Grandmother took my hand, her eyes kind. "You just got here, are you settling in all right? This family's poor, don't think less of us for it." I answered quickly, warmed by this rare sincerity. Yaoi pulled me aside eagerly, whispering tips about the market and drying fish. Already acting familiar after just meeting me, grandfather clapped Beixiu on the shoulder, his voice warm. "Now that you've got a spouse, treat them right, don't let them suffer." Zion smiled gently, saying little, but his eyes were warm and genuine. I thought to myself, at least this family had some support to lean on. Late in the afternoon, a middle-aged woman walked into the yard without greeting anyone, her eyes raking over me from head to toe. "So this is Beixiu's spouse. Looks decent enough, though who knows if you're any good at running a household." That was Madame Su, Beixiu's birth mother. She didn't sit, just wandered around the room with her eyes, sizing up every item as if pricing it. "Poor as this place is, the betrothal gifts couldn't have amounted to much. Don't go thinking you're owed anything by this family." Her voice carried an obvious edge of suspicion. I gave a faint, distant smile and didn't respond right away. This one, I needed to watch closely before deciding how to deal with her. That evening, I sat on the porch watching the shoreline, observing how the villagers dried their fish. The fish were laid straight on the sand, uncovered, swarmed with flies, a good portion spoiling before they even finished drying. I recalled a few simple food preservation methods from my past life, the right ratio of salt, drying on raised bamboo racks with good airflow, away from direct, harsh sun. An idea began to take shape in my mind. Done right, the next batch of fish could sell for far more instead of losing half to spoilage like this. I told myself this might be the first way for me to find solid ground in this new life. Beixiu came home once it was fully dark, his clothes soaked through, carrying a modest basket of fish. "The sea was rough today, didn't catch much," he said, a little apologetic. I took the basket from him and shook my head. "It's fine. From tomorrow, let me handle the selling, you just focus on going out to sea." He looked at me for a moment, surprise flickering in his eyes before it softened. "If you want to run the household, that's fine with me, just don't wear yourself out." That simple sentence caught me off guard. It was the first time anyone had willingly handed me the reins without asking for anything in return. That night, I lay looking up at the sparse thatched roof, listening to the distant murmur of the waves. This life wasn't one I'd chosen, this husband wasn't what I'd expected either. But at least he was kind, sincere, with no intention of mistreating me the way I'd once feared. I clenched my hand gently and told myself, if fate had pushed me here, I wouldn't let myself live weakly. A prying mother-in-law, a heartless birth family, this run-down house, all of it would change, starting with my own 2 hands. Tomorrow, I'd begin with the first step, a new way of salting fish. Early the next morning, I went to the fish market at the edge of the village to watch how people did business. Fresh fish sold for almost nothing since everyone caught their own, and spoiled fish just got thrown away. I borrowed some coarse salt from a neighbor and went home to test a curing method I remembered from my past life. Salt spread evenly in thin layers, not piled up, drying on a raised bamboo rack away from flies and the damp rising off the sand. My first batch wasn't large, just enough to test. I sat watching over it the whole afternoon, turning each fish so it dried evenly, my heart a mix of nerves and hope. This was the first thing I was building with my own 2 hands in this life. 3 days later, the batch of dried fish was ready. I brought some over to grandmother to try. She took a bite, her eyes lighting up instantly. How did you make this so fragrant, not fishy, not overly salty like usual? I gave a brief explanation about the right amount of salt and the proper drying spot. Grandmother nodded approvingly and told me to take it to the market to sell. I brought a small basket to the market and sat beside the other fish stalls. At first, no one paid attention, but once an old woman tried a free sample and praised it, people started gathering to buy. The basket of dried fish sold out completely before noon, bringing in far more than selling fresh fish ever did. I held the money in my hand, a strange feeling rising in my chest, not because the amount was large, but because this was the first thing I'd earned entirely on my own in this world. Back home, I did the math right away. If I made a larger batch, curing and drying it properly, the income could multiply several times over. That evening, I told Beixiu about the market when he came back from the sea. He listened, then nodded slowly. Then starting tomorrow, I'll try to catch more, so you'll have enough fish to work with. The next morning, Beixiu woke earlier than usual and took the large net out to sea. I stood on the shore watching his boat disappear into the morning mist, uneasy. His leg still hadn't fully healed, and the sea was never gentle. I went back inside and built a bigger drying rack in the open yard, laying out salt in baskets. Yun stopped by to help, chatting the whole time. You're something else, only here a few days and already figuring out how to make money. I laughed, not taking all the credit, just saying I'd been lucky to remember a few old tricks. Beixiu came home in the late afternoon, his boat fuller than usual. I ran down to the shore to help with the basket, noticing his soaked clothes and tired face, though his eyes lit up at the sight of the drying rack full of fish I'd made the day before. Does your leg hurt? I asked, looking at his uneven steps in the sand. Beixiu shook his head, his voice light. I'm used to it, I'm fine. I didn't fully believe him, but I didn't press either, quietly filing it away. Sooner or later, I'd have to deal with getting his leg properly treated. A few days later, I expanded my stall at the market, not just selling dried fish, but also trying a new way of fermenting fish sauce, richer and more flavorful than what the village usually made. Word spread by mouth, and my little stall quickly became a regular stop at every market day. Someone asked to buy in bulk to resell up in town, and I agreed right away, casually asking how much higher the prices were there. A bigger plan started forming in my mind. I wasn't going to stop at selling small baskets one at a time. That night, I sat doing the accounts by lamplight, carefully recording income and expenses on an old sheet of paper. Beixiu sat beside me, quietly watching me work, occasionally glancing at the scrawled numbers I wrote in my own style. Where did you learn to write? He asked, a bit curious. I hesitated for a beat, then answered vaguely that I'd been taught a little as a child. Beixiu didn't press further, just said, "Good. From now on, leave the household accounts to you. I trust you." That simple line warmed something in me I couldn't quite name. Madame Su came by again, this time wearing an unusually friendly expression. Heard you've been doing well with the business lately, thought I'd come see for myself. Her eyes swept over the drying rack full of fish, calculation plain on her face. I invited her to sit, poured tea, but didn't rush to show off how the business was going. How much does the dried fish sell for a pound? She asked, probing. I gave a vague answer, not the real number. Madame Su lingered a while longer, circling around the subject of profits, and I just smiled thinly and let it pass, this one. I needed to be more careful with by the day. Yixian came by to help build another drying rack, chatting as he worked. You two are really coming up in the world, the whole family's glad to see it. I asked about Madame Su, and Yixian sighed, giving me the short version. She'd used hardship as an excuse to ask the children for money more than once, not just Beixiu. I filed the information away, growing even more certain about the need to set clear boundaries from the start, so money wouldn't become an excuse for anyone to interfere in our small household. A trader from up in town came through the village market, and hearing about my dried fish, sought me out directly. He tried a piece, nodded in approval, and offered to place a large standing order every week at a price far better than retail at the village market. I was pleased but kept my composure, haggling a bit before settling on a price. The trader laughed. Little miss, ah, little sir, you're quite the businessman. I laughed at his flustered choice of words, but was secretly satisfied. From today on, my business had moved up to a whole new level. With money in hand, I brought up buying Beixiu a new net, a sturdier one so he wouldn't struggle as much out at sea. He hesitated, saying we should save instead of rushing to replace the old one. I shook my head, firm. A good net catches more fish, the money will come back fast, don't worry. In the end, Beixiu gave in, a little helpless in the face of my resolve. No one's ever dared argue with me about money like you do. He said it without a trace of annoyance. If anything, there was something like quiet amusement in his voice. That afternoon, Beixiu and I went to the market to buy the new net. Passing the fabric stall, I stopped to admire a sea blue shawl, not planning to buy it but lingering a little too long. Beixiu noticed and quietly went back to buy it while I was busy haggling over the net. On the way home, he handed me the shawl, a little awkward. Saw you liked it, so I bought it. I held the shawl in my hands, at a loss for words, just smiling softly. It was the first time anyone had paid attention to a small preference of mine like that. Late that night, Beixiu and I sat on the porch, looking out at the quiet sea. He told me about his childhood, going out to sea with his father, about his father's death in a fierce storm, leaving him and his mother with this poor house. I listened quietly, understanding a little more why Madame Su was always so harsh. Perhaps it was the weight of raising a child alone from such a young age. Things will get better for us, I said softly. You won't have to risk your life out there like before. Beixiu turned to look at me, his eyes still bright even in the dark night, in a way that felt strangely striking. My dried fish stall had built a real reputation in the area by now, traders from up in town placing regular orders, savings piling up nicely. I started thinking about repairing the house, at the very least fixing the roof properly before the storm season hit. But just as everything was going smoothly, Madame Su appeared at the gate again, this time without any of her usual false warmth, carrying a proposal that made it clear right away. Real trouble was about to begin, not from the sea, but from someone inside the family. Madame Su stood at the gate, hands on her hips, her eyes sharp and cold, nothing like her warmth the day before. I've thought it over. Since you two are doing well now, I'll move in here so it's easier for me to look after you both. I paused for a beat, looking straight at her, keeping my voice steady. The house is small, I'm afraid it wouldn't be convenient. What do you mean small? I only need a little corner. She brushed off the refusal and stepped straight into the yard as if it were already decided. I stood in front of her, blocking the way. This fight, I knew, wasn't one I could afford to go soft on from the very first move. Beixiu got home just in time to see the standoff. He set down his fish basket, his voice low but firm. Mother, we've already talked this over, the house isn't big enough, you stay where you are, and I'll keep sending your support money regularly. Madame Su rounded on her son, her voice cracking with anger. So now that you've got a spouse, you're forgetting your mother. It's not about forgetting you, it's that you can't interfere in our household. Beixiu answered without flinching. I stood beside him, a rare feeling of being protected rising in my chest. Madame Su wouldn't back down, turning her attack on me directly. This Zhang boy must have put some kind of spell on Beixiu, barely here a few days and already egging him on to talk back to his own mother. I gave a faint, unbothered smile at the baseless accusation. I've never egged him on to do anything. This is just a household matter and it's up to the two of us to decide. You, Madame Su choked on her anger, her fingers shaking as she pointed at me. Yi Zion arrived just in time and stepped in. Mother, don't make a scene, the neighbors will hear. Madame Su huffed and finally left, though the look on her face as she turned away was still full of resentment. That night, Beixiu sat quietly on the porch, looking troubled. I sat down beside him and asked gently, "Are you upset with me for talking back to your mother today?" He shook his head, sighing. "Not upset with you, it's just, she raised me alone since I was a child. She's not the kindest person, but she's still my mother. I can't bring myself to cut her off completely." I understood the conflict weighing on him and didn't push him to pick a side right away. "I'm not telling you to cut her off. I just need our home to have clear boundaries so she knows where the line is." Beixiu nodded slowly, taking my hand and giving it a gentle squeeze. A few days later, the grandparents came by on their own, having heard the whole story. Grandfather thought for a moment before speaking. "You did the right thing." Back in the day, Madame Su used hardship as an excuse to ask the other grandchildren for money plenty of times too. "This isn't the first time." Grandmother took my hand, her voice warm. "Don't worry, with your grandfather and me and the whole family behind you, Madame Su can't do anything to you." I was moved by this unexpected support, feeling steadier than ever. It turned out I wasn't fighting this battle alone after all. Madame Su wasn't ready to give up so easily. This time she changed tactics, weeping loudly in front of the neighbors, spreading word around the village that Beixiu's spouse was ungrateful, refusing to let their mother-in-law rely on them in old age. The rumors spread fast, and a few people started eyeing me with suspicion when I went out to sell at the market. I didn't panic, calmly explaining to anyone who asked directly. The house was too small, the support payments were still being sent regularly, nothing was being neglected. Gradually, the truth won out, and the rumors died down. Yun stopped by and told me a few more old stories about Madame Su, how she'd once forced Yi Zion to hand over his entire wedding fund for her to manage, and had borrowed money many times since without ever paying it back. "You've got to stay firm from the start. Go soft once and she'll push and push." I nodded, more determined than ever. I started setting aside a fixed amount every month as a gift for Madame Su openly in front of the whole family, so she'd have no grounds to claim she was being neglected, but also no room to demand more. One afternoon, Madame Su showed up again, this time wearing a pitiful expression, claiming she was seriously ill and urgently needed money for medicine. I didn't believe her right away, gently suggesting we take her to the village physician to be checked properly, offering to pay for the medicine directly instead of handing over cash. Madame Su's face changed, and she stammered out excuses to decline. I smiled, having clearly seen through the trick. "If you don't want to see the physician, that's fine, but I can't just hand over cash on faith." She stormed off angrily, without another word. Beixiu had witnessed the whole thing, and once Madame Su was gone, he turned to look at me, his expression a mix of admiration and guilt. "I'm sorry you have to deal with this." I shook my head, taking his hand. "No need to apologize. This is our home, both of ours. I won't let anyone push us around." He looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, "I never thought I could trust anyone this much until you came along." That simple sentence made my heart skip in a strange, unfamiliar way. Word of the dried fish stall's success reached Madame Su through a few acquaintances, making her even more bitter. This time she changed approach, seeking Beixiu out alone while he was at sea, pushing hard for him to manage the money I was earning, instead of letting me handle everything myself. Beixiu came home and told me about it, sounding a little worn down. I told her straight out, the household money is yours to manage, I trust you completely, tell her not to interfere anymore. Hearing that, warmth spread through me at his steadiness. Having failed through Beixiu, Madame Su shifted to pressuring us by bringing in distant relatives to lecture us, spreading talk of a domineering spouse, a husband too weak to say no. Grandfather heard about it and went to speak to Madame Su directly, bringing up in front of the relatives every time she'd borrowed money and never paid it back. Madame Su had nothing left to say in her defense. After that meeting, the gossip died down quickly, and no one dared bring up the old stories in front of grandfather again. On a stormy night, Madame Su suddenly knocked at the door, soaked through, saying her roof was leaking and she had nowhere to stay. I looked out at the pouring rain and despite everything, couldn't bring myself to leave her out in it. I let her stay the night, laying out warm blankets, but made it clear. This was only temporary shelter from the storm and she'd have to leave the next morning. Madame Su seemed caught off guard by my attitude, none of her usual harshness showing. That night she was unusually quiet, no demands, no complaints like before. The next morning, before leaving, Madame Su paused at the gate and said a short line. "Thank you for last night." I was a little surprised, just nodding in response. It was the first kind thing she'd ever said to me without any calculation behind it. I wasn't ready to believe this was a genuine change of heart, but at least the boundaries between us had been clearly established. She couldn't push her way in as easily as before, and I wasn't completely closed off to her either. The battle with my mother-in-law settled down for the time being, and life fell back into its usual rhythm. The dried fish stall grew busier by the day, savings finally enough for me to think about something bigger, repairing the house before the coming storm season. But just as everything seemed to be falling into place, the sky on the horizon suddenly darkened unnaturally. The older fishermen in the village began murmuring, staring out at the sea with worried faces. A major storm was likely on its way. The whole fishing village scrambled to prepare for the storm. People hauled their boats up to higher ground, tied down their roofs, stocked up on food. Beixiu and I reinforced the drying racks, carefully securing every corner of the house. The wind picked up in gusts, carrying the sharp tang of sea spray. "We need to pull our boat up higher too," Beixiu said, hurrying toward the shore despite his uneven gait. I followed close behind, helping as much as I could even though my strength didn't match his, uneasy as I watched the sky turning an ominous gray in the distance. That night, the storm hit harder than anyone had expected. The roof rattled violently, the wind howling without pause. Beixiu and I huddled in the sturdiest corner of the house, listening to the sea roar as if it might swallow the whole village whole. In the middle of the storm, a faint cry for help drifted in from the shore. Beixiu shot up immediately. "Someone's trapped out by the moored boats." I grabbed his arm to stop him. "Your leg still hasn't healed, don't go out there now." But he pulled free and ran straight out into the wind and rain. I stood inside, my heart pounding, unable to stay still. Finally, I grabbed a rain cloak and ran out after him, staggering as the wind knocked me around. In the distance, I could see Beixiu and a few other fishermen struggling to pull a small boat free from the rocks it was caught on. A massive wave surged in and swept someone into the water. Without a moment's hesitation, Beixiu dove in after them, his limp all but vanishing in his desperate effort to save the man. I screamed his name into the howling wind, my chest aching with fear. After what felt like an endless stretch of terror, Beixiu managed to drag the man safely to shore. He collapsed onto the sand, gasping for breath, his left leg trembling from exhaustion. I ran to him and threw my arms around him, tears mixing with the rain on my face. "You scared me to death." I choked out, my voice shaking. Beixiu wrapped his arms around me, his breath ragged. "I'm fine, don't cry." The storm still raged around us, but in that moment, all I could feel was the beat of his heart against mine. The storm cleared by morning, leaving the village scattered with wrecked boats and debris washed up along the sand. Beixiu rested at home, his leg aching again after the strain of the night before, and I stayed by his side, still shaken from the fear of the night before. "Thank you for saving that man." I said softly, tucking the blanket around him. Beixiu took my hand, his voice warm. Thank you for running out to find me. We looked at each other for a long moment, no words needed. Everything that mattered was already there in our eyes. A few days after the storm, I went out to the shore to clear the debris that had washed into our yard. Among the seaweed and broken shells, I stumbled upon a strange lump, pale gray, with a faint, unusual scent unlike anything I'd ever seen wash up before. I brought it home and carefully tucked it away in a hidden corner, planning to ask someone knowledgeable before deciding what to do with it. A vague feeling stirred in me. This thing might not be ordinary at all. I brought the strange object to the oldest fisherman in the village. He picked it up, sniffed it, and his eyes went wide with astonishment. This is ambergris, extremely rare. Merchants in the big city have hunted for it for years and don't always find it. I froze, stunned that something I'd picked up off the beach could be worth so much. The old man warned me carefully. You need to keep this quiet, don't let word get out. If the wrong people find out, they'll try to take it from you. I kept the ambergris a secret, only telling Beixiu about it. He listened, thought for a moment, then said, We'll need to go to the big city to sell it for a good price and keep it safe. No one here could afford something like this. I nodded in agreement, my heart a mix of nerves and excitement. We talked it through carefully and decided not to rush into anything, waiting until Beixiu's leg had recovered a little more before heading to the city together, both to sell the ambergris and to find a skilled physician who could finally treat his leg for good. While we waited, I kept expanding the dried fish business, teaching Yun and a few neighbors the proper curing technique, and in exchange they'd watch the stall for me when I was busy. My relationship with Beixiu's family grew closer through these small collaborations. Beixiu also started letting me get more involved in the work at sea, not going out on the water, but learning how to sort and price the different kinds of fish and seafood the village fishermen usually caught. One afternoon, I found a few pieces of red coral caught in Beixiu's fishing net, their color far more vivid than the ordinary white coral usually found in these waters. I kept them carefully, remembering what the old man had said about how much city merchants prized rare materials from the sea. Do you come across this kind of coral often? I asked. Beixiu shook his head. Very rare, only found out at the deep reefs. It's dangerous, so few people dare to dive down that far. I carefully put the coral away, adding it to the list of things to sell when we got to the city. Madame Su caught wind that something unusual was going on in our household and came around to dig for information again. But this time I was more careful, giving nothing away about the ambergris. She poked around asking questions for a while before leaving, clearly disappointed she hadn't gotten anything out of it. I let out a breath of relief, more determined than ever to keep this quiet until we'd actually sold it for a good price, avoiding any unnecessary trouble before everything was settled. Beixiu's leg gradually improved after the strain of the storm, still limping but with far less pain than before. We began preparing for the trip to the big city, the most important journey since the day I'd transmigrated into this world. Hearing the news, the grandparents insisted on lending us extra travel money, even though I declined since we already had enough. Take it just in case, the road's long and full of surprises. Grandmother pressed a small pouch of silver into my hand, her eyes full of genuine worry. The night before we set off, Beixiu and I sat together checking our luggage, carefully wrapping the ambergris and red coral in thick cloth and hiding them at the bottom of the trunk. If this goes well, our family's fortune really will change, I said, full of hope. Beixiu looked at me, his eyes gentle in a way I rarely saw. With you by my side, I'm not afraid of anything wherever we go. I flushed at the unexpected words, quickly ducking my head to keep packing. Early the next morning, we set off, renting a donkey cart from an acquaintance in the village to take us to the city. The road out of the fishing village wound along the coast, the scenery gradually shifting from simple, thatched houses to livelier towns as we drew closer to the city. Beixiu sat beside me on the cart, occasionally glancing at me with a look of unmistakable regard. I could feel the change in how he looked at me now compared to the early days of our marriage, no longer wary, but steady with trust. Near the city gate, we ran into a patrol checking goods coming in and out. I was a little nervous with the ambergris hidden away in our trunk, but luckily the soldiers only gave it a cursory look before waving us through, noticing nothing unusual. Once inside the city, the bustling, prosperous scene left me stunned for a moment. Crowded streets. Shops lined up one after another, completely different from the small, quiet fishing village I just left behind. We found an inn to stay at, settled our luggage, and discussed our plan for the next day. First, finding a skilled physician to examine Beixiu's leg again, and then figuring out the safest way to sell the ambergris and red coral. That night, lying in the unfamiliar room in the middle of the bustling city, I held Beixiu's hand tightly, feeling a strange mix of nerves and unusual calm. A new chapter in both our lives was about to begin. The next morning, we went to the largest medical hall in the city to have Beixiu's leg examined again. The elderly physician looked it over carefully and nodded. The old injury has been left a long time, but there's still a chance. With acupuncture combined with tendon-strengthening medicine and a few months of persistence, you should be able to walk normally again. I was overjoyed, immediately putting down a deposit for the medicine and scheduling regular treatment for the rest of our stay in the city. Beixiu looked at me, the corner of his mouth curving up. Thank you for not giving up on this leg. That afternoon, I brought the ambergris to a well-known spice and incense shop in the city. The shopkeeper's expression changed the moment he saw it, carefully inviting us into a back room, not daring to name a price out in the crowded front of the shop. After a thorough examination, the shopkeeper offered 500 taels of silver, along with a warning to keep the transaction quiet. Beixiu and I looked at each other, both struggling to hide our shock at such a staggering sum. Leaving the spice shop with a valuable banknote tucked away, Beixiu and I went to find a jewelry shop to sell the red coral as well. The shopkeeper there also offered a generous price, over 100 more taels of silver on top. Stepping out of the shop, I gripped Beixiu's hand tightly, both of us at a loss for words for a moment. Now we have enough to build a new house, buy a bigger boat, and get your leg completely fixed, I said, my voice trembling with emotion. Just as we were heading back to the inn, a familiar voice rang out behind us, stopping me in my tracks. Zhang Xia, is that really you? I turned around and saw Zhang Defu standing there, looking far more haggard than before, with Madame Tan and Qiu beside him. Why are you here, father? I asked, my voice cold. Zhang Defu stammered, his eyes darting repeatedly toward the banknote I just tucked into my sleeve. He'd clearly seen everything. Madame Tan cut in, her voice suddenly warm and familiar, nothing like her attitude before. Look at you, doing so well these days, dressed so nicely. Qiu stood behind her, looking haggard, her eyes swollen from crying. I glanced at them and knew right away something was up. If you have something to say it plainly. I had no patience for beating around the bush. Zhang Defu sighed and explained that the Liu family in town had sent Qiu back. The marriage had fallen apart, her reputation ruined, and now they needed a large sum of money to remarry her off. I figured you're doing well now, so help your sister out. Think of it as family looking out for each other. Zhang Defu said, pleading. I looked straight at him, not bothering to hide the coldness in my eyes. My marriage was swapped out for Qiu back then, my betrothal gifts taken without a single coin left for me, and now you're asking me for help? Madame Tan's face darkened, about to raise her voice, but Beixiu cut her off first. We know exactly how you treated my spouse back then. There's no lending money today. Qiu suddenly dropped to her knees in the middle of the street, sobbing dramatically, drawing the attention of passers-by. Brother, I know I was wrong. Please forgive me. Help me just this once. I watched the familiar performance, feeling none of the wavering the body's former owner might have once felt. Get up. Kneeling in the street solves nothing, I said, calm. What happens to you is your own responsibility to carry. I'm under no obligation to make up for it. Zhang Defu grew furious, loudly accusing me of being ungrateful and heartless. Passers-by began to gather, murmuring among themselves. I didn't flinch under the public pressure. If anything, I spoke up clearly for everyone to hear. The day I was married off, not one person in that family asked how I was doing. My betrothal gifts were taken clean, and now you show up demanding money because my sister got sent back by her husband's family. Tell me, is that fair by any standard? The crowd murmured in agreement, casting looks of contempt toward Zhang Defu. Seeing the tide turn against them, Madame Tan changed her approach, switching to threats. If you won't help, don't blame me for reporting you to the authorities for being unfilial to your own father. Beixiu stepped forward ahead of me, his voice ice-cold. Go ahead and report us. Let the magistrate decide who's in the wrong. As for what happened back then, the switched marriage, the stolen betrothal gifts, we can file a counter-complaint just as easily. Madame Tan choked on her words, unable to respond. Zhang Defu pulled at her arm, muttering something, and hurried the whole family away under the watchful, judging eyes of the crowd. Back at the inn, I was still a little shaken, the anger not yet settled. Beixiu poured me a cup of warm tea and sat down beside me, his voice gentle. You handled that well. No need to go easy on people like that. I nodded, leaning my head against his shoulder, feeling the exhaustion slowly melt away. From now on, I only have one family. I said quietly, not sure if I was speaking to Beixiu or to myself. He squeezed my hand tightly, saying nothing more, but that squeeze was answer enough. A few days later, while we were out buying materials to prepare for building the new house, an unfamiliar servant approached, saying their mistress wished to meet me. It turned out to be the magistrate's wife, who had heard about the exchange on the street the other day and was curious to meet me in person. The meeting turned out unexpectedly warm. She praised how clearly and firmly I'd handled the family matter, and even offered to help if the Zhang family ever caused trouble again in the future. With this new connection, I felt much more at ease thinking about the possibility of the Zhang family coming to cause trouble again down the road. Beixiu and I spent our remaining days in the city buying all the materials we needed for construction, and ordered a boat much larger than our old one. The boat builder promised delivery to the village in about a month. I stood looking over the design for the new boat, hope rising in my chest for a sturdier future for the both of us. On our last night in the city, Beixiu took me for a walk through the brightly lit night streets. He bought me a small silver hairpin shaped like a sea wave. Every time you look at this, remember that the sea gave us a new beginning, he said, unusually bashful. I pinned the hairpin into my hair, catching my reflection in a bronze mirror by the roadside, and thought quietly to myself, this honest, steady man had, without my even realizing when, become the strongest support I had in this unfamiliar world. Early the next morning, we set off for home, carrying hope for a completely new life. The physician gave careful instructions on how to care for Beixiu's leg going forward and arranged for regular follow-up visits back in the city. On the way home, I leaned against Beixiu's shoulder, watching the scenery pass by outside the cart, feeling strangely at peace. The trouble from my birth family felt truly settled now, and all that lay ahead was the path of building a home with the person I loved. Back in the fishing village, news that the new boat would soon arrive had the whole household buzzing with excitement. I got straight to work hiring workers to repair the old house, adding a bigger kitchen and a small storeroom for the dried fish to avoid the space shortage we'd dealt with before. Beixiu, still supposed to be resting his leg per the physician's orders, kept trying to help oversee the construction anyway, and I caught him more than once sneaking up to walk around too much. Sit down and rest, let me handle this, I scolded, half worried, half exasperated. Right on schedule a month later, the large boat arrived at the village, drawing the whole fishing community out to see it. The hull was sturdy, the hold twice the size of the old boat, capable of going out farther and carrying far more fish. Beixiu stood admiring the new boat, his eyes bright with a joy he couldn't hide. Never thought our household would ever get this good, he said. I looped my arm through his, smiling. Just take care of your health, leave the rest to me. Every day, I diligently massaged Beixiu's leg exactly as the physician had instructed, along with a steady regimen of tendon-strengthening medicine. Some nights the pain left him drenched in sweat, and I'd sit beside him, holding his hand tightly, never leaving his side. "If it hurts, just say so, don't try to bear it alone," I said, my voice catching with worry. Beixiu squeezed my hand back, smiling through the pain. "With you here, I can handle any amount of pain." I lowered my head, hiding the sting in my eyes. The small seafood processing workshop behind the house was starting to run smoothly, and I hired a few more villagers to help with curing fish and drying sauce, paying them fairly. Yun became my right hand, managing the accounts whenever I was busy caring for Beixiu. Word of our dried fish and sauce spread well beyond the village, with traders from other coastal towns now placing orders too. Life gradually settled into a steady rhythm, worlds apart from the struggling early days after I'd first transmigrated here. One afternoon, I received a letter from Lai Zihao saying he'd be stopping by the fishing village for a few days on family business nearby. I was thrilled, rushing to prepare for his visit, and told Beixiu about the friend I'd met in the city. "Is that the young gentleman who helped you catch a thief and sell your jade?" Beixiu asked, a brief, barely noticeable shadow passing over his eyes. I nodded, not catching the strange flicker on his face. Lai Zihao arrived at the fishing village on a bright, sunny morning, bringing an armful of fine gifts from the city. He looked around our thriving household in surprise, full of praise. "You're really something, barely a few months and you've already built up a whole processing workshop like this." I laughed, leading him around to show him everything. Beixiu walked alongside us, watching quietly, his eyes growing colder, his guard visibly rising. That evening, I invited Lai Zihao to join us for dinner. Over the meal, he shared plenty of interesting stories from the city, occasionally clapping me on the shoulder affectionately as he recalled memories from when we first met. Beixiu sat beside me, his chopsticks slowing noticeably, his eyes drawn repeatedly to the hand resting on my shoulder. After the meal, once Lai Zihao had gone to rest, I noticed Beixiu seemed quieter than usual. "What's wrong?" He shook his head, not answering directly, just quietly clearing the dishes. That night, Beixiu tossed and turned, unable to sleep. I turned to look at him in the dark and asked softly, "What's on your mind that you can't sleep?" He was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice hesitant in a way I rarely heard. "You and young Master Lai. You two seem so close, I just worry." He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood right away. I laughed softly, turning to wrap my arms around him. "He's a close friend, and you're the one I want to spend my whole life with. Of all the people to be jealous of, why him?" Beixiu was quiet for a moment, then pulled me even closer, his voice low and rough against my ear. "I'm not used to this feeling. I'm afraid that one day you'll find someone better than me and leave." I looked up at him, my heart softening at this rare glimpse of vulnerability. From the moment I stepped into that palanquin, I decided this was my home, and you're the one I chose to stay with. I said, my voice steady and certain. "There's no one better than you in my heart." Beixiu squeezed my hand tightly and said nothing more. The next morning, Lai Zihao noticed the shift in the atmosphere and, catching me alone, asked me straight out. I told him honestly what had happened the night before. He burst out laughing, clapping me on the shoulder. "Turns out your husband gets jealous too, and here I thought he was all cold and stoic." Afterward, he sought Beixiu out privately and made it clear he only saw me as a close friend, nothing more. Beixiu listened, looking embarrassed, and sincerely apologized for the misunderstanding. A few days later, Lai Zihao said his goodbyes and headed back to the city. Before leaving, he pulled me aside. "Take good care of your husband, someone that good is hard to come by." I laughed and nodded, warmed to have gained such a genuine friend. After seeing Lai Zihao off, I headed home and found Beixiu waiting for me at the gate, his eyes gentle, nothing like the tension of the past few days. After that small misunderstanding, Beixiu became noticeably more open about showing affection, no longer as quiet as before. Every evening, he'd make a point of telling me about his day out at sea, big catches and small, sometimes reaching for my hand without any particular reason at all. I realized the distance between an arranged marriage and real love had all but disappeared by now. Every day spent by his side left me feeling steadier and more at peace. After months of consistent treatment, Beixiu's leg had improved dramatically, his walk nearly normal now, only a slight limp showing up when the weather turned cold. The physician from the city came for a routine follow-up, nodding in satisfaction at the progress. At this rate, by next year no one will even be able to tell your leg was ever badly injured, the physician said. Beixiu beamed, turning to look at me, his eyes full of unmistakable gratitude. The seafood processing workshop expanded again, and I started thinking about hiring an actual manager to help with the accounts, to lighten my own workload. Yi Zion volunteered for the role, both trustworthy and convenient since he was family. Our little household's life kept getting better and better, and the grandparents came by often to share meals with us, the warmth of family thick in the air, so different from the early days after I'd first arrived here. One peaceful evening, Beixiu suddenly took me out to the shore to watch the sunset, to the very spot where he'd first taught me to read the tides back when I'd first married in. He held my hand, his voice unusually serious. Since the day you came, my whole life changed. There's something I want to tell you, truly. I looked up at him, my heart beating faster than usual. I love you, not out of duty as a spouse, but because I truly want to spend the rest of my life with you. The waves lapped gently at our feet, witness to the most sincere confession I'd heard across 2 lifetimes. I threw my arms around Beixiu tightly, my voice thick with emotion. I love you too, truly, without a shred of doubt left. The sunset painted the sky and sea alike in orange, 2 figures embracing, silhouetted against the sand with no distance left between an arranged marriage and real love. From that moment, I knew one thing for certain. No matter how fate had pushed me into this unfamiliar world, into a life that wasn't originally mine, the man standing beside me now was the truest, rightest thing fate had ever given me. By the following spring, my seafood processing workshop had become one of the largest operations in the fishing village, with its own fleet of 3 boats and more than a dozen workers employed steadily. Beixiu only went out to sea now when he genuinely wanted to, spending most of his time managing the fleet and helping me with the books. Never thought our household would ever get this well off, he said, standing on the shore admiring the 3 boats moored side by side. I looped my arm through his, pride swelling in my chest at everything we'd built together. Madame Sue's attitude had shifted completely these days, often stopping by to help watch the workshop in her free time, no longer demanding or prying like before. Perhaps time and my own steadiness had finally taught her where the boundaries needed to be. You've really grown into something these days. I was harsh with my words before, don't hold it against me, she said, sounding unusually sheepish. I smiled, not bringing up the past, just answering, it's in the past. I'm glad you're in better spirits now. The grandparents were growing older, their health gradually failing, and Beixiu and I made a point of visiting often, bringing nourishing food. One afternoon, grandfather took my hand, his voice slow. Ever since you came, this family finally has real life in it again. Your grandmother and I can rest easy now. I felt a lump in my throat, gripping his hand tightly. Beixiu stood beside me, his eyes just as red. This small, poor family from before had become a solid support for the whole clan. My birth family hadn't dared cause trouble since that encounter in the city, and I only occasionally heard news through acquaintances. Zhang Defu was still living under Madame Tan's thumb, and Qiu had been forced to remarry an older widowed merchant in a distant county. Hearing the news, I felt nothing stir in me at all. In this life or the last, I'd learned not to let people who didn't deserve it take up space in my mind for long. I had a small, cozy extra room built onto the old house, meant for the grandparents whenever they wanted to stay over for a while. Yun joked that I managed a household so well I could pass for a natural-born homemaker, no matter where I'd really come from. I laughed it off without offering any further explanation about where I'd really come from. Some secrets, I figured, only needed to be known by me and Beixiu. One evening, Beixiu came home with a small wooden box inside a plain, simple pair of silver rings. Our wedding was rushed back then. I never got you anything proper. Now that we can afford it, I want to do it right this time. I held the ring in my hand, my eyes stinging with emotion. Whatever you give me is precious, as long as it's from you. Beixiu slid the ring onto my finger, his movements careful, as if he were holding the most precious thing in his life. The whole fishing village was invited to a small celebration held right on the beach, which Beixiu openly treated as a second wedding for the two of us. The grandparents sat in the seats of honor, beaming with pride at their grandson and his spouse. No, at the two children they loved as their very own. Yun and Yi Zion bustled around handling the party, the beach filled with a warm, festive energy. I stood beside Beixiu, watching the sunset settle over the water, a strange sense of peace washing over me. During the celebration, Lai Zihao made a point of stopping by to offer his congratulations, bringing a special gift from the city. "Seeing you this happy puts my mind at ease," he said, clapping Beixiu on the shoulder like old friends. Not a trace of tension remained from the earlier misunderstanding. Beixiu shook his hand, his gaze sincere. "Thank you for always looking out for my Zhang Xia." I stood watching the two men who'd once had a bit of friction between them, now clearly on good terms, warmth spreading through my chest. After the party wound down, Beixiu and I sat alone on the sand, watching the stars reflected on the still surface of the sea. "If you hadn't come into my life back then, I don't know what my life would look like now," Beixiu said softly, his voice warm. "Probably still a kind fisherman, just one who hadn't yet met someone who truly loved him," I answered, resting my head on his shoulder. Beixiu pressed a light kiss to my hair, saying nothing more, letting the silence speak for 1,000 words of love. A few months later, our workshop was selected by the magistrate to supply dried seafood for the whole region's major festival, our reputation spreading further than ever. I watched the line of carts loaded with goods pulling out of the village, my mind drifting back to those early days struggling with that first small batch of salted fish. Beixiu stood beside me, draping an arm over my shoulder. "This is all thanks to you," I shook my head, smiling. "It's thanks to both of us. Neither one of us could have done it alone." On a peaceful morning, I woke to find Beixiu already up, sitting and mending an old, worn-out net, the very first one he'd used back in the hard days, now kept as a keepsake. "Why not just throw it out? You've got new nets now," I asked, sitting down beside him. "I keep it to remember how poor we used to be. It makes me appreciate everything we have now even more," he answered, his eyes distant with memory. I took his hand, a wave of gratitude rising in me for the fate that had brought me here. That afternoon, Beixiu and I stood on the shore, watching a flock of seagulls circle in the clear blue sky. The life I once thought had ended in another world had turned out to be just the beginning of a new chapter, one more complete and full of warmth than anything I could have imagined. "In our next life, if fate allows it, I still want to be your spouse," I said softly, gripping Beixiu's hand tightly. He squeezed back just as firmly, a rare smile spreading across his sun-browned face. "No need to wait for the next life. This life I've already got you, and I'm never letting go." The waves washed gently over the sand, witness to a joyful ending for this unexpected journey through time. Zhang Xia entered this marriage with nothing but 2 empty hands and an identity that wasn't even his own, and yet became the one to turn a crumbling straw house into solid ground, not through the sheer luck of finding a piece of ambergris, but through the courage to take control and set boundaries with both his husband's family and his own from the very first day. If it were you, caught between a forced marriage with a genuinely sincere partner and the chance to return to your old life but leave everything behind, would you choose to stay or to go?